Today at 6, a woman is found guilty of murdering her husband, whom she'd claimed coerced, controlled and physically abused her for years. Penelope Jackson stabbed her husband David 3 times with a kitchen knife, admitting the attack when police made their arrest.
I admit it all.
All right.
Just get them. All right, I want to go in, all right?
No,
So,
he's on the kitchen floor.
yeah, we need should have stabbed him a bit more.
She's been sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years, also on the programme. In the row over post-Brexit fishing rights, France threatens to block British vessels, while the UK says 2 can play that game. Making treatment for the menopause cheaper, prescription charges for hormone replacement therapy in England will be cut. The President meets the Pope at the Vatican, with both hoping for progress at next week's climate talks in Glasgow. And celebrating immigration into Britain, a festival to mark 150 years of the Royal Albert Hall.
And coming up on the BBC News channel.
We start at...
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. A woman has been found guilty of murder after stabbing her husband to death following a row over a birthday meal. Penelope Jackson, who's 66, attacked David Jackson, who was 12 years older, with a kitchen knife at their home in Somerset in February. Mrs. Jackson claimed he was violent and coercively controlling. She was sentenced to life in prison at Bristol Crown Court. With more, here's Andrew Plant.
February this year, and police arrive at a bungalow on the Somerset coast.
Hello, madam. Do you need to step outside for me a minute? Can you come outside?
Yes.
Thank you.
Penny Jackson opens the door, filmed on police body cam. Inside, her 78-year-old husband is dying. The retired Lieutenant Colonel has called police to say she stabbed him.
I admit it all.
All right.
Just get them. All right, I want to go in, all right?
No,
So,
he's on the kitchen
Yeah.
floor.
Paramedics arrive.
with any luck, they'll be too late.
Oh, should have stabbed him a bit more. He's an aggressive bully and nasty, and I've had enough. And when he said you wouldn't do it, I did it twice more. I am complicit.
Okay, are you with the patient?
As she waited for the police, she told 999 she'd stabbed her husband with a kitchen knife.
So in total, how many times?
3 times.
3 times, okay.
Once I thought I'd get his heart, well, he hasn't got one, and then twice in the abdomen.
While she waited, Penny Jackson wrote this note entitled Confession. She said, "I have taken so much abuse over the years," adding, "May he rot in hell." In court, the retired accountant said she was ashamed of what she'd said and done. She'd admitted manslaughter but denied murder, claiming she'd been subjected to control, coercion and physical violence throughout their 24-year marriage.
But the judge said it was Penny Jackson who'd been the controlling one in their marriage. He said he had no doubt that she had intended to kill her husband, and he added she had shown not one shred of remorse for what she'd done throughout this whole trial.
There's only been one voice in this trial, and that's of Penelope Jackson. David Jackson hasn't been able to respond to the allegations put to him around the history of domestic abuse, and that was a really difficult issue for the jury to make a judgment on.
Further arresting you for murder.
Good.
I've already cautioned you.
David and Penny's daughter read a statement in court. She said from the moment an officer knocked on her door in February, her world changed forever, and she knew she'd lost not only her dad, but her mum too.
And Isabel, their daughter, read out in that emotional statement to the court today that she and her husband are now pregnant with their very first child, and that, she said, is a grandchild that her father will now never get to see. Penny Jackson was sentenced to life in prison today. She will serve a minimum term, Clive, of 18 years.
Andrew, thank you for that. Andrew Plant there live in Bristol. The French ambassador to the UK has been summoned to the Foreign Office over the escalating and increasingly acrimonious row over post-Brexit fishing rights. The French are unhappy about a decision from the UK and Jersey last month to deny fishing licences to dozens of French boats to access British waters. In response, the French seized a British trawler and another was fined during checks near the port of Le Havre. Let's get the very latest now from our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth.
Jersey is on the front line of the fight over fishing rights, caught in an escalating row. Authorities here and across the UK say they have issued licences to French boats that can prove a history of fishing these waters, as agreed after Brexit. But France says dozens have been unfairly denied. The local fishermen, like their counterparts across the Channel, are frustrated and worried.
The feeling amongst the fleet yesterday was one of absolute despair. Certainly there are real difficult times ahead, and our big worry down here is how are we going to try and preserve the fleet and come out the other end with the fishing fleet intact.
This week a British trawler was detained by French authorities in a dispute over paperwork, a warning shot about what might follow. France has threatened further checks on vessels, said it could stop British boats landing at French ports, even suggested it could disrupt cross-channel trade or energy supplies. Today, UK ministers said they were prepared to retaliate.
Two can play at that game is what I would say, but in the first instance what we're doing is raising this with the European Commission. It's always open to us to increase the enforcement that we do on French vessels, to board more of them if that's what they're doing to our vessels.
Today the French ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office, a rare public rebuke for the threats made. But while the language on both sides is ramping up, they are still talking. Both here and in France, fishing is an emotional issue which carries political clout. Boris Johnson promised British fishermen Brexit would mean a better deal. In France, President Macron's facing an election which brings its own pressures. Both sides have reasons to take a tough stance, but both know a serious escalation could be damaging. This spring, French boats staged a protest off Jersey over the same issue. The UK says it wants a diplomatic solution to this ongoing dispute. France has set a deadline of Tuesday for it to be resolved.
There is a time for flexi muscles and put your trump cards on the table, and there are times for negotiations. The next step is really negotiation.
This afternoon, the Prime Minister left Downing Street to head to Rome to meet world leaders, including President Macron, who arrived earlier. There, the two are expected to have talks on the fringes to see if they can relieve this tension. Well, in the last few minutes, we've heard that the Prime Minister did speak to reporters on the plane on his way to Rome about this. He said he was puzzled about what was going on. There may have been a breach of the Brexit agreement and that the UK stands by to take whatever actions needed. He did suggest he would raise it with President Macron, but he said he would remind him of the long history of a close relationship between France and the UK, saying the ties that unite us and bind us are far stronger than the turbulence that currently exists. He said he'd be surprised if France did try and disrupt cross-channel trade, but he did say the UK would do whatever necessary to protect its interests. Of course, this hasn't been the only point of tension between the UK and France in recent months. There is rarely a friendship that comes without a falling out. It is most often how you make up that really counts.
OK, Alex, thank you. Alex Forsyth there at Westminster. The UK recorded higher levels of COVID infection in the week to last Friday than at any time last winter. The Office for National Statistics estimates 1.3 million people would have tested positive, or 1 in every 55. In the last few minutes, the government has announced more flexibility on when people in England can get their booster jabs. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pim.
Booster jabs like these being delivered in Leeds today are seen by ministers as vital in the drive to keep ahead of the virus. They're offered 6 months after a second dose, but from today there'll be flexibility on that, with some getting the jabs more quickly, including in care homes.
What we've done now is working with the NHS is to say that you can have more flexibility and be more pragmatic on the timing. And what that really means is if someone is very close to the 6-month point but not quite there, that the NHS could just be pragmatic. So, for example, if a doctor is visiting a care home and there might be 1 or 2 residents that are just short of the 6-month point, they can use their discretion.
Infections among school children have been one of the main factors in a recent rise in COVID cases. Overall numbers are now falling a little, but half-term may be part of the explanation as fewer pupils come forward for tests. The Office for National Statistics does regular household testing, which picks up the underlying trend. The latest ONS survey suggests that last week 1.3 million people in the UK had the virus, higher than the peak in January. In England, 1 in 50 people had the virus. In Wales, it was 1 in 40. And in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, 1 in 75 people. There were increases in all the UK's nations. So what might the ONS data tell us about this week when it's published?
I wouldn't be surprised to see a reduction in our data in the next week or so. However, what we saw this time last year was that little half-term reduction followed by a significant increase. So I really am not being complacent there.
COVID hospital admissions are about a quarter of the level they were in January, thanks to protection offered by vaccines. But there are warnings that the months ahead could yet be challenging with the spread of the virus.
We seem to have stalled at a high level of infection, which is not where we want to be as we move into winter. It's really difficult to tell what's going to happen next. We could have exponential growth, or we could see a gradual decline.
Wales has the highest infection rates in the UK, and new measures are being brought in to tackle the virus. COVID passes are being extended to cinemas, theatres and concert halls, and other venues may yet be included. The First Minister said the pandemic is far from over. Hugh Pim, BBC News.
Well, the government's latest coronavirus figures for the UK show there were nearly 43,500 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That's nearly 6,000 fewer cases than last Friday. It means an average of just over 41,000 new cases were reported per day in the last week. The number of people in hospital with COVID was close to 9,000 as of yesterday. There were 186 deaths, that's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test, which takes the average number of deaths over the past 7 days to 152. The total number of people who've died with COVID now stands at just over 140,000. On vaccinations, 86.7% of people aged 12 and over have now received a first dose, and nearly 80% have been double jabbed. And 7.2 million people have received their booster jabs. This includes third doses for those with certain health conditions. Buckingham Palace says the Queen's doctors have advised her to continue to rest for at least the next 2 weeks, which means she won't be able to attend this year's Festival of Remembrance on Saturday, November the 13th. With me now is our correspondent Helena Wilkinson. So, what more do we know about it?
Well, we had the statement, Clive, in the last 20 minutes or so from Buckingham Palace. We know the Queen has been resting on doctor's orders at Windsor Castle. It follows her stay in hospital last Wednesday overnight for preliminary investigations, is how it was described. Doctors had advised the Queen to rest for a couple of days. We know that she cancelled her trip to Glasgow on Monday for a reception for COP26. Well, now doctors have advised the Queen to have further rest for, in their statement from the palace, at least the next 2 weeks, And the statement goes on to say that doctors have advised the Queen that she can carry out those light desk-based duties, but she is not to carry out any official public duties for at least the next couple of weeks. And we have seen her, haven't we, carry out those video conferences. And in fact, last week she did look incredibly well. But further rest for the Queen. As you say, she is going to miss that date on Saturday the 13th for the Festival of Remembrance. However, the palace says it remains that the Queen's firm intention to be present for the National Service of Remembrance on Sunday the 14th of November.
OK, Helena, thank you. Helena Wilkinson there. Treatment for the menopause is to be made cheaper, with the government announcing that prescription charges for hormone replacement therapy, or HRT in England, will be significantly reduced. Women will now only have to pay once a year for HRT prescriptions, which the government says could save up to around £200 annually. In Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, prescriptions are free. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has that story.
They're menopausal and they came to Parliament Square to shout about what that means. Among them, some famous faces who've made breaking taboos around the menopause a personal mission.
I'm trying to help one woman at a time, but in there we just saw the start of something where it feels like all women will get helped. And it wasn't political, it was the beginning of a female revolution, you know.
I'm postmenopausal, so
for many women, the symptoms that come with menopause can be a shock.
Affected the way I was thinking and feeling. Yeah, from confidence to mood swings to brain fog.
Adele now combines running this pub in Kent with helping other women through a life stage that she found challenging.
I felt like I just completely lost myself. And at the time, I just didn't know what it was. Sorry. No. It was menopause. And this is why I do what I do. Because I just didn't want another woman to look in the mirror and lose themselves like I did.
Adele says hormone replacement therapy helped her. It's free on the NHS in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but has to be paid for in England. Adele's patches cost £9.35 a time on the NHS, but other women can face a double charge if their treatment contains two hormones.
Carolyn Harris.
In the House of Commons, a Labour MP who's been a leading campaigner on menopause pushed for change.
There's no avoiding the menopause for half of the population. Most women will spend at least a third of their lives either perimenopausal, postmenopausal or the joy menopausal. We must ensure that for those women who need it, they are not denied HRT because of financial restraints.
The Minister agreed. She said she would look at the charging policy for treatments which contain two hormones. She also said doctors will be able to prescribe a year's worth of HRT for the cost a woman would usually pay for one batch.
I can tell the House that we will amend the regulations to reduce the costs and improve access to HRT. So instead of paying for a repeat prescription every month or every 3 months, the prescriber can issue a batch of prescriptions for up to 12 months with one signature and one prescription charge.
So HRT won't be free in England, but it will cost less. Another step in what seems to be a growing move to make real changes for women at a crucial stage of their lives. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
It is 17 minutes past 6, our top story this evening. And Penelope Jackson is found guilty of murdering her husband. She'd claimed she'd suffered years of coercion, control and physical abuse.
And I'm John Sopel in Rome, where President Biden has been meeting the Pope to discuss climate change.
Coming up in Sports Day on the BBC News channel, a win at last for the defending champions West Indies at the Men's T20 World Cup, but they are taken to the very last ball by Bangladesh in a thriller in Sharjah.
Schools across the UK have been marking Black History Month this October, and from next year, Black History will become a mandatory part of the curriculum in Wales. That isn't the case, however, in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, despite repeated calls from campaigners. At the moment, teachers can choose whether or not to include Black history in lessons. Here's our Community Affairs correspondent, Adina Campbell.
He's actually huge in history. Garrett Morgan. You know traffic lights? Before, traffic lights were red and green. So he invented the amber in between to make a three-way traffic light.
New discoveries about Black pioneers. Classrooms in Cardiff, like many others in the UK, have spent the last few weeks exploring Black history.
It's a really important thing. It's great to learn about where you came from, the struggles that people in your family have had.
As we get older, our country's going to become more diverse. We have to learn to respect one another, our cultures, our traditions.
Black History Month continues to be divisive. Every year we hear the same debates. It's a token gesture. Why does it only last for a few weeks? And concerns about the range of content available and discussed. But yet, perhaps more than ever, when there's been a sharp refocus about the black experience, race and racism, some say it's even more necessary. And that's what's happening here in Wales, the first home nation to take action.
From September next year, black and other ethnic minority history will be taught in all Welsh schools, a move welcomed by campaigners. And last month, a statue of Betty Campbell, Wales's first black head teacher, was unveiled in Cardiff. But for most children in the UK, October is the only time in the school calendar they learn about black history. Way too little and undervalued, according to the UK's first black studies professor.
Well, I think the first thing would be to scrap how we think about history, how we think about social studies generally. I'll just take it, just get rid of it and start again. When you think about the British Empire, Africa, Caribbean, Asia were part of Britain. So when we think about the Caribbean as being somehow separate or somehow a different history, we really missed the point.
Why, only yesterday, in the Morning Chronicle.
But it's the personal discoveries which can mean even more. Actor Patterson Joseph, who's written and performed a play about Britain's first black voter, was so moved by his story, he's about to release a book about the hidden historical figure.
The more we know about ourselves, the more confident we are. So when I discovered Ignatius Sancho, for example, my confidence grew. Of course I belong here, for many reasons. Some of them negative, but a lot of them very positive.
Icons of the past, many hope will be better acknowledged in the future. Adina Campbell, BBC News.
E-cigarettes could soon be prescribed on the NHS in England to help people stop smoking tobacco products. The Medicines Agency, the MHRA, has updated its guidance to allow manufacturers to submit their vaping devices for regulatory approval. It could mean England becomes the first country in the world to prescribe e-cigarettes as a medical product. President Biden has met the Pope at the Vatican ahead of a meeting of G20 leaders in Rome. Earlier, the Pope had urged governments to come up with effective responses to deal with rising carbon emissions. This weekend, the United Nations COP26 climate summit gets underway in Glasgow with the aim of coming up with firm proposals to limit emissions. Our North America editor John Sopel is travelling with the US President.
The ruler of the world's preeminent superpower en route to meet the world's most powerful religious leader. But for Joe Biden, only America's second Roman Catholic president, this is an audience with his spiritual guide and clearly someone he admires enormously.
You are the most significant warrior for peace I've ever met. And with your permission, I'd like to be able to give you a coin. I know my son would want me to give this to you.
The president gave him a coin as a gift and then joked about his Irish heritage.
I'm the only Irishman you've ever met who's never had a drink.
And the Pope chose the BBC today, in particular thought for the day on Radio 4, to deliver a firm message to the political elite ahead of next week's crucial COP26 summit.
The political decision makers who will meet at COP26 in Glasgow are urgently summoned to provide effective responses to the present ecological crisis and in this way to offer concrete hope to future generations.
Joe Biden agrees with the Pope about the urgency, but will words be matched by actions?
The motorcades will be sweeping through Rome this weekend, through Glasgow next week. World leaders tasked with saving the planet. So no big deal then.
Around the world there have been protests of varying size to chivvy world leaders into action. This was the scene in Tel Aviv today. In Glasgow, outside where the summit will be held next week, the demonstrators seem to be outnumbered by security guards. And in London, Greta Thunberg was the star attraction. She's buried somewhere in this mob of photographers. And she had this message for President Biden.
When you are a leader of the most powerful country in the world, then you have lots of responsibility. And when the US is actually, in fact, expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, that is a clear sign that they are not really treating the climate crisis as an emergency.
And this salvo to other nations from the former California governor and Terminator star.
All of those countries that come and give speeches and say, we're not going to go and lose jobs because of this going green and all this, they're liars. They're just stupid and they don't know how to do it.
Joe Biden on this trip to Europe wants to show that America is leading the world on tackling climate change. But his 85-vehicle convoy, most of which were flown in from the US, may not be leading by example, or in this holy city, practicing what you preach. And Joe Biden has praised the Pope for his leadership over climate change and also on vaccine distribution around the world. If that meeting was all sweetness and light, his encounter with President Macron of France altogether more difficult after that defence cooperation deal signed between the United States, Britain and Australia, which has cost the French tens of billions in lost submarine contracts. Joe Biden conceded that the Americans had been clumsy over it and had been under the impression that the French had been told. I'm not sure whether they kissed and made up, but they seem to have healed some of their divisions.
OK, John, thanks for that. John Sopel there live in Vatican City. Archaeologists working on the route of the HS2 high-speed rail link have uncovered what they've described as an astounding set of Roman statues. Two complete figures appearing to be a man and a woman and the head of a child were found at an abandoned medieval church in Buckinghamshire. To mark the 150th anniversary of the Royal Albert Hall, a new festival is opening tonight to celebrate the contribution of immigrants to British life and culture. A concert by the musician Nitin Sawhney begins a week of events at the hall showcasing the immigrant experience. Nitin has been speaking to our entertainment correspondent, Colin Patterson.
Nitin Sawhney at the Royal Albert Hall rehearsing Journeys, his new work highlighting the contribution immigrants have made to the UK. It's the opening concert of a festival he has created, which focuses on this topic.
The idea was to counteract any kind of negative ideas of immigrants and who they are. I really think people who came over to this country from the Caribbean or from Africa or from India, or Pakistan, a lot of them have got very strong, amazing and inspiring journeys that I wanted to reflect in the music.
Nitin Sawhney's parents emigrated from India in the 1960s. He was born and grew up in Kent, and he is worried about what he sees as a tougher stance on immigrants and refugees today.
I've seen attitudes change in the course of my lifetime. When I was young, there was the National Front, who actually were very, very anti-immigrant. There was a time during the 2012 Olympics where we were really embracing multiculturalism. Things have shifted again, I think, and there's been a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment.
Do you understand, though, why people have concerns when they see the daily crossings from Calais and there's people who are losing their own jobs and struggling?
No, I don't see it. I get frustrated when I see it. I think it's based on bigotry and prejudice, and it's just as simple as that.
Preetha Narayanan is an American of South Indian heritage who's been living in the UK for the last decade.
Being a female Hindu Indian violinist, to be able to come and be at a very important English institution that's historical, that's classical, that kind of dichotomy and that interaction is really special. It's important for voices like mine to be heard because we have the potential to impact the next generation.
Born in right or wrong location?
Sanjeev Bhaskar will be reading one of Nitin Sawhney's poems. The two have been friends since university and together developed the sketch show Goodness Gracious Me.
Bombay is the restaurant capital of India. So how come every Friday night we end up here, eh?
Because that's what you do, eh? You go out, you get tanked up on lassis and you go for an English.
When we started, we didn't see people like us that were in a position to have a public platform which you could curate a week like this. We just didn't see those kind of people around, and I think we're very much now part of the fabric of society, whether people like that or not.
And while this is only the start of the Journeys Festival, Nitin Sawhney hopes its impact will continue to travel. Colin Patterson, BBC News.
Time for a look at the weather now, and Thomas Schaffenacker is here. Hi there, Thomas.
Hi there, Clive. Well, rain's obviously been the story across some parts of the country. The river levels are running pretty high across the northwest of England, southern parts of Scotland too, and there's more rain on the way this weekend. But if there is some good news, well, the good news is that the rain should be moving swiftly through, but we'll have a succession of bouts of rain through the weekend. Now, right now, it's fairly quiet out there for most of us, but through the course of the night, the next weather front moves in, and you can see where it's raining through the night across western parts of the UK. And this is 6 o'clock in the morning, so from central southern England, just about into the Midlands, and right across these western coasts as well. So the east should wake up to some dry weather, possibly even some sunshine in places like Norwich. But that weather front will be sweeping through during the course of Saturday. So that also means that later in the morning, western areas will dry out. But this weather front will probably linger for quite some time in the extreme northeast of England, around the borders, eastern Scotland as well. But for many of us, actually Saturday afternoon isn't looking too bad at all. Plenty of lengthy sunny spells and occasional showers as well. 15 in the south is possible. And the evening on Saturday is also looking dry. The winds will drop out. It's actually not going to be bad out there at all Saturday evening, Saturday night, before the next weather front moves in. So this is a low pressure that's moving across Ireland early on Sunday morning, and you can see the rain wrapping around the centre of this low pressure. So this is the morning, and swiftly moves the weather front towards the east through the morning. There'll be some very strong winds also around western coasts of Wales, the southwest of the country too. And again, after a wet morning, Sunday afternoon and evening is looking dry and brighter with some showers, but it is going to be quite muddy out there. And of course, it's Halloween. Some of us might be trick-or-treating, so be prepared for some muddy conditions out there, even though the sun might just pop out in time.
OK, Thomas, thank you for that. Thomas Schaffenacker there. That's it. So, goodbye from me. Now on BBC One, let's join our news teams where you are. Have a very good evening.